We continue our discussion of conic sections, and we're going to look at the part that makes an ellipse. We cut or slice a cone with a plane and such that it's not parallel to the base of the cone, but it is not parallel, so it's slanted, and the cross section gives us an ellipse. The definition of the ellipse is a set of all points, the sum of whose distances from two fixed points called foci, that's the plural of the word focus, is a constant. So looking at this demonstration, the sum of the distance here is going to remain the constant of 6. Here are our two foci, here's a point, and if you measure the red distance from foci 2 to the point and foci 1 to the point and add those together, the definition, the sum is a constant. Let's see, does it stay constant as that point moves around the circle? So here you can see that distance and that distance, add them together, it's still 6. And as I rotate around, you can definitely see that the sum of the distance remains to be 6. As we look at the ellipses, we can have two kinds. One whose major axis is parallel to the x-axis, and yes, we call that the major axis because it's the longest axis. The two foci are located on the major axis, and its length is 2a. I remember major goes with a. So that means this length is a, and that length is a. The minor axis, of course, is the shorter axis. That length is b, that is b, so it gives us a whole length of 2b. Again, the foci are always located on the major axis. That's going to become very helpful in our problems to follow. They are the same distance from the center, but we're going to label that distance. We're going to call it C. C is the distance from the center to each focus. Again, C is the distance from the center to each focus. What's this next part? What's the endpoints of the major axis? Well, that point and that point, that's a vertex. That is a vertex. And the plural of the word vertex, vertices. So vertices are the endpoints of the major axis. We have an equation of the ellipse where the major axis is parallel to the x-axis, again with the center h and k. That should sound familiar. HK was the vertex of our parabola. Here we have the center. Also, same type of thing. We have those minus signs. They're grouped together. H goes with X, K goes with Y, alphabetical. A goes with the major axis. So that's why the major axis is parallel to the x-axis, because the bigger number is underneath X. And then how does that C get involved? Where does that focus come involved? Where there's a relationship between A, B, and C, where C squared is A squared minus B squared. And of course when you subtract, you always want to subtract where you have a positive difference. We don't want to go into imaginary world. We also can have an ellipse whose major axis is parallel to the y-axis. And again, our foci are located on that major axis. Our vertices are the endpoints of the major axis, and all those relationships are the same. The distance from each focus to the center is C. The distance from the center to each vertex is A, that major axis, and then we have the minor axis where you have a length of 2b. Look at this equation. It's not much different than the other one. The only thing that's different is that those two numbers are switched. And you really don't need to know A and B. You just need to know that A is always the biggest. And if the biggest number is underneath Y, then you have a vertical major axis. So taking this first example, we want to find the center, the foci, vertices, and graph, not necessarily in that order. So looking at that equation, let's find the center. Again, HK, opposite values because of that minus sign as part of the formula. So let's plot that. Now, how do we get the other stuff to graph it? Easy. We take those two numbers. Let's take the square root of 4, which is plus or minus 2, and since that is underneath x, we're going to go in the x direction. So we're going to go side to side from the center 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. Then we're going to take the square root of 9, and since that's underneath the y, we're going to go up and down from the center 3. And then we're going to connect those dots as best we can to form an ellipse. So I've graphed it, I found the center. Now what about the other stuff? Well, let's look at those vertices. What's the vertices? The vertices are the endpoints of the major axis. How do I know that's the major axis? Because it's the biggest. 9 is bigger than 4 and it was underneath y. So those are our vertices. Well, what are those 2 points? Just look at the graph. -4 up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and -4 down 1. Also, I could have taken the center and from the y value, since I went up and down 3, I could have added up and plus or minus 3 to 2 and gotten 5 and -1. So now I found the vertices. What about the foci? Well, this is where you've got to know this relationship. Does that look familiar? Kind of looks like the Pythagorean theorem, except has a minus sign. Well, let's just fill in what we know. I know a squared is 9 and b squared is 4. Again, those two numbers are a squared and b squared, where a squared is always the biggest. If I subtract, I get 5. If I take the square root, I get plus or minus 5. That's not the foci. C is the distance from the center to each focus. And they're on the major axis. So that's about 2.14. So a little bit bigger than 2 each way. Now you don't have to graph those. I'm just trying to show you on the graph where they are located. What are the actual coordinates? Well, -4 from the center 2, and I went up and down the square root of 5. Those are your two foci. Those are your vertices. That's your center, and I've graphed it. Let's look at the second example. Oh wow, this doesn't look anything like number 1 because this is not in standard form. So we need, once again, just like we did on the parabolas, we need to complete the square. So let's get our x's together. Let's get our y's together and move everything else to the other side. Now, in order to complete the square, the coefficient of our squared term has to be 1. That one's not. So what can we do with that one? We can factor out whatever number that is. So it's a positive 9. So I'm going to factor out a 9 out of those two values. That leaves me -2y. Now I can complete the square. So I want to take half of positive 6, which is positive 3 squared, and add that to the other side. I want to take half of -2, which is -1, and square it. But wait, I don't just add 1. That's being multiplied to the 9. So I've really added another 9. Now I can rewrite that as x plus 3 squared plus 9 times y minus 1 squared. If I add all that together, I get 9. Almost in standard form, that has to be a 1. So let's divide everything by 9. Now those do cancel out, but I'm going to go ahead and put a 1 there just because I want to. Now it's in standard form. So what's my center? Remember HK, so I have -3, positive 1. I'm going to take the square root of 9, and since that's underneath x, I'm going to go side to side 3. Then I'm going to take 1, that 1 right there, take the square root, and that's underneath y, so I'm going to go up and down 1. from my center, and then graph the best ellipse I can, which isn't great. So I have found the center, I've graphed it. Now let's do those vertices. Again, those are the endpoints of the major axis, and since 9 was biggest underneath x, those are my two vertices. So again, I can just look at the graph and say it's that and that, or remember I added 3, again, just happens to be 3 again from the last example, to my x value because I went side to side because my vertices are along that major axis. Now I need to find the foci. So I use that relationship, biggest minus the smallest. So I have c is plus or minus the square root of 8. I'm going to go ahead and simplify that to 2 square roots of 2. I am not done. That's just c. Remember, c is the distance from the center to each focus. So somewhere along right here are the two foci. Now what are their ordered pairs? Well, again, if I take that center and I add or subtract that plus or minus 2 to the x coordinate, that comma shouldn't be there, those are my coordinates of my foci. Let's just do another one just to get that practice. Again, not in standard form, so I need to group my x's together, group my y's together, and move everything else to the other side. Can't start completing the square because those values aren't 1. So I need to factor them out of just this part. This gets factored out of there. And now I can complete the square. Take half of 4, which is 2, square it. Don't just add 4. What's 4 times 25? 100. So that's what I've really added to the left side. Take half of negative 8, square it. Again, that's positive 16 times 4 is 64. Now I can rewrite those in factored form, add that together, and get 100. Almost standard form. Last thing, I need to make this value a 1, so I'm going to divide by that value and reduce. Now keep in mind I'm giving you nice pretty numbers so you don't have to deal with some ugly fractions. Alright, so let's look at the center. Remember HK, so we have negative 2, 4. Then we're going to take the square root of 4, which is plus or minus 2, and that's underneath x, so again side to side. Then plus or minus 25, I'm sorry, the square root of 25 is plus or minus 5, and that's underneath y. So I go up and down, or in the y direction. Then graph it the best I can. Let's talk about those vertices. Again, the endpoints of the major axis. And how far did I go up and down? Plus or minus 5. So I'm going to have negative 2, 4, plus or minus 5. But I don't want to leave my answers like that since I actually can add those numbers. Or of course you could just read them off the graph. Last thing would be your foci. Those two numbers, biggest minus the smallest. You should know your major axis in this case is the vertical one. Again, that's the distance from the center to each focus. And again, you do not have to plot those. I'm just trying to show you that they are located on the major axis. So my foci is negative 2, 4, plus or minus the square root of 21. And again, I'm taking my center value and I'm adding the c distance to the y coordinate because I went up and down. I can't simplify that any further. So those are your two foci.